Othello? Oh hell no, it's Segaiden episode 14. For our second, and thankfully finally, look at the Othello Multivision system, we're going to look at the 5 games that were published in 1984. While there's nothing in here that's quite so existentially shattering as Space Mountain, there's also nothing that hits the relative highs of Qbert. Overall, this is a sort of spongy, indeterminate mass of gray nothingness. I'm not really that happy about it either. First up, we have Sannin Mahjong. Now, if you know how to count in Japanese, then you will realize that this Mahjong is the missing Mahjong link. We've seen 2-position Mahjong games, and we've seen 4-position. However, only Tsukuda Original had the courage to create Mahjong for 3 people. Surprisingly enough, upon reading on this game, I learned that 3-player Mahjong is an actual variant in Riichi Mahjong, with its own distinct rule set. Meaning this cartridge actually does stand apart from the others in Japan's rapidly growing digital Mahjong library, and its existence is fully justified. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by pretending I have anything meaningful to say about this game. It's pretty similar on a visual level to Mahjong titles for Famicom and SG-1000, because there's only so much you can do on 8-bit hardware to put an interesting spin on small yet necessarily legible depictions of real-world playing pieces on a green background. About all that makes this version stand out is its incredibly strident audio quality. I suppose that's par for the Multivision. The only notable thing is something that's kinda bad. Can you believe that I've covered hundreds of 8-bit games for Japanese systems over the past 7 years, and this is our very first horse racing simulation? I suppose my good luck streak had to end at some point. Challenge Derby falls into a category of ubiquitous games in the Japanese market that I sincerely fail to see the appeal of. Even a pachinko video game has the ostensible merit of letting you practice for real tables. But what good is a horse racing simulation? You don't control the horses here, you simply wager on which horse will win. I find it unlikely that these horses are based on real-world competitors, and even if they are, how much shelf life could a video game snapshot of a racing competition observation have in terms of being a useful tool for informing your actual bets at the real-world track? I suppose the hook here comes in the form of the multiplayer. Whatever else you want to say about Challenge Derby, at the very least it does have the distinction of including multiplayer competition for up to 8 people. You begin the game by inputting your name, or actually up to 8 names, and then everyone on hand makes their wagers. This form probably makes perfect sense to people who are familiar with actual horse racing, but as I've never had the impulse to indulge that particular vice, these rows and numbers are basically unfathomable to me. You have 100,000 yen, about $1,000, to burn here, and you can place your bet on your favorite horse. Once you do, you sit and watch them make their way across the field for about a minute or so, during which time you have no influence on the action. And then it repeats. You keep wagering until you run out of cash, or become wealthy beyond your imagination. And that's the entirety of Challenge Derby. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Well, that was a delight. Now we come to the one Multivision game that's actually been mentioned a few times on Video Works over the past few years. Okamoto Ayako no Match Play Golf, a rudimentary take on the sport which nevertheless deserves some credit for stumbling clumsily toward the simulation setup that HAL and Nintendo ended up perfecting with Nintendo's Golf for NES. Match Play Golf is a competitive take on the Lynx, which bears the name of Ayako Okamoto, a Hall of Fame golfer and one of the sport's all-time most successful competitors. The cover bears a kind of grotesque caricature of her, though in-game you only see her as a sort of abstracted figure facing away from you. It's a pretty ambitious attempt to present golf for its era. Hold this up to Champion Golf, and it makes the Sega-published game look pretty ancient by comparison. For starters, Match Play Golf attempts to recreate the golfer's viewpoint by rendering each hole from a low-to-the-ground angle. This gives it a greater sense of immersion than the top-down view that was more common to this point, and each hole looks distinct, and is rendered from multiple angles to mimic the approach. It has a real vintage computer look about it, as everything but the ball is rendered as a background rather than a sprite, and has to be drawn block by block. Each scene takes a couple of seconds to resolve on screen, and since the computer-controlled Okamoto and our competitor, your avatar, are drawn as backgrounds as well, they flicker as they swing. Nevertheless, it looks quite impressive for a console game in 1984, more primitive in some respects than Nintendo's Golf, but in some ways it's bolder. The perspective shift as you move in toward the green is particularly nice. Similarly, Match Play Golf almost figures out the idea of swing meters. When you tee off, you're given a choice of your club and your preferred swing type. Once you've made those selections, you control your swing by pressing the controller button to stop an arrow as it moves along a color-coded impact guide. This determines the power of your swing, though as far as I can tell, the blue center segment is meant to be optimal force, and hitting at the extremes of the bar will cause you to fluff a swing. It's not as fluid or robust as the Famicom game, but there's no shame in being eclipsed by a release that was bounds ahead of the rest of the genre. All told, Match Play Golf is probably Multivision's most impressive release. Not the one that plays best necessarily, but the one that feels the most inventive, and quite the opposite of the next release. The Multivision may have only had 8 unique cartridges released during its short and very unhappy life, but you shouldn't be surprised that one of those games was a Xevious clone. I keep telling you, that game was huge in the 80s. Space Armor takes some very obvious cues from that Namco hit, though it is nowhere near as good as the real thing, as Famicom fans would discover for themselves when Namco's excellent conversion of the arcade game arrived on their consoles around the time of Space Armor's release. Really, the best thing I can say about Space Armor is that it's less dire than the other Multivision game with space in the title. Space Armor is hilariously slow, with scrolling that absolutely crawls forward. This gives you ample time to luxuriate in its rich backgrounds, which consist of colored hexagons. Lots of colored hexagons. Your ship flies around shooting airborne threats and bombing the occasional ground-based emplacement. These destructive bits are as monotonous as the backgrounds they protect. You'll find none of the manic cleverness of Xevious' bad guys here. These aliens lack the clever behavior of the Andor Genesis' minions. For example, the basic flying enemies home in right on your ship mindlessly. One of Xevious' defining features was that designer Masanobu Endo wanted the bad guys to seem intelligent. So rather than suicide attacking the player, the rabble enemies would break away and evade the instant they crossed the Solvalu's line of fire. The bad guys here just kinda smash into you slowly. Likewise, the ground-based enemies are mostly just missile emplacements that fire a rocket straight ahead if you happen to trip their line of sight. No homing projectile or real sense of aim here. I guess it's kind of neat that the missiles are persistent objects that disappear once fired, but there's just not much to do here besides shoot stuff, slowly, across endless identical backgrounds. Like Space Mountain, this looks and feels a lot like an amateur coding effort, and like Space Mountain, it's one of the SG-1000's Shi-to-No, with a price inversely proportionate to its quality. Good luck finding this one, let alone for less than 1,000 bones. And finally, our final Multivision game, an adaptation of Milton Bradley's 8-bit James Bond 007. Being based on a pretty solid multi-platform title, James Bond 007 holds up as one of the better releases for the Othello Multivision. It's not as good as Q*bert, but it's also not the kind of thing that makes you want to retire from playing video games forever, which actually puts it above the system's average. It's nice to end on a comparative high note. If I were to describe James Bond 007 for Multivision at all, I guess I would call it a blend of Irem's Moon Patrol and Konami's Scramble, with a bit of underwater combat. James Bond 007 ostensibly represents half a dozen films, though in practice this all boils down to the same thing. You drive around in a tricked-out Aston Martin, shooting stuff. For example, the segment based on The Spy Who Loved Me has you swimming around the ocean shooting ships, and dropping depth charges onto underwater bases. The Diamonds Are Forever bit has you driving and swimming out to an oil rig while shooting killer satellites and lines of diamonds floating overhead that shield the satellite and will blast the screen with irritating flashes when shot. The Moonraker segment puts you back in the water where space shuttles launch upward and you attempt to blast the Moonraker satellite out of the sky. For Your Eyes Only attempts to destroy your eyes by putting you in a black ocean that constantly flashes orange to reveal the hidden threats within the water. It's all a bit samey and monotonous, but your bidirectional attacks, you fire upward at 45 degrees and launch depth charges in a downward arc, at least gives it a distinct personality. Given the pervasiveness and wide availability of this game on early 8-bit consoles, including the ColecoVision, This release is pretty inessential, considering its fairly hefty cost on the aftermarket. But at least Tsukuda Original abandoned its dreams of first-party fortunes with a big name, which is more than you can say for most failed consoles. And that thankfully wraps it up for 1984's post-crash console creations in their entirety. Well, I guess there was the Epoch Super Cassette Vision, but nah, onward to 1985. Next time on Segaiden, thankfully, we get back to the Sega stuff.